So we'll be looking forward to Sarah getting to know you all as we go through this year's budget process.
Thanks, Emily.
Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. Sorry, it made more sense to do that before walking through the whole agenda after I started to say it. So we're going to start out. Colleen's going to take us through the quick review of the Clean Water Board budget process. We're going to review some of our approach and resources. We're going to spend about 20 minutes talking about context with staff from various agencies, departments. Really, our goal here today is to try to build a foundation for how we're going to approach the budgeting process this year. We anticipate it'll be a challenging year with variables that we haven't necessarily had in the last 3 to 5 years. So we've got 30 minutes after that working on just board discussion, setting our strategic direction, trying to, again, we're not making budgeting decisions today, but we are really trying to talk through some issues ahead of time so that later on in the season, when we have more refined information, when we have targets ready, we have covered some of this ground already. Then Secretary Moore will take us through a quick overview of the results of the last legislative session. Then we'll have our public comment and wrap up. Any questions before we start moving through that agenda?
May I just add one piece, if that's okay, Chair Farnham? I also just wanted to share that this new board meeting is an effort to be responsive to last budget process. There was a lot of really excellent guidance and direction that the board provided, but we felt very time constrained because by the time we have our October board meeting, we're already well on our way to put the budget through the public process to meet the administration's budget deadline for December. And so we wanted to provide this additional step in the process so that we could hear direction and guidance from the board without the time pressures of the public comment period starting up in the fall. And so we will take what we learned today and hear from you all and bring that back also to the interagency work group, who we work really closely with staff across all 5 agencies to do the budget build over the course of the summer. So just wanted to add that little extra bit of context and how we debriefed from last year's budget process and hope to add this as an improvement moving forward. Thank you.
Thanks. All right, with that, I think we're ready to move to Colleen.
I'm going to scroll down for you, Colleen, and zoom out.
Perfect. Okay, I'm going to take us through the budget process starting from now July to next July. So this will look a little different than it has in years past because, as you know, we're adding this board meeting today in July. So just for some context, each of these boxes represent an action of an entity. So the yellow is an action of the emergency board. Gray is an agency action, green is an action of the Clean Water Board, and the blue is an action of the legislature. So starting in the upper left corner, that's where we are today in the July board meeting. Next, the emergency board will meet twice a year, kicking off a meeting in late July this year. They'll meet again in January. So that meeting in July will officially kick off the budgeting cycle, and the e-board will adopt a consensus revenue forecast for the state fiscal year 2027. Then the interagency staff will coordinate with us on the QUIP team and prepare a draft budget before the October board meeting. So that October board meeting is on October 9th this year. That's when the board will consider and discuss the draft budget and approve any materials for the public comment period. This year, the public comment period is between October 16th and November 16th. And then the public hearing this year is on November 7th, which is where the board can hear comments from the public on directly on the budget. After that public comment period ends, there's some time for staff to review those comments. And then at the December board meeting, which this year is on December 2nd, the board will consider public comments and decide if any changes should be made to the budget recommendation for the governor. Then that change will be sent over to the Agency of Administration, and all agencies will update their Clean Water Fund and capital bill language. The governor takes all that information and proposes a full budget to the legislature. And then between January and April of next year, the budget will be reviewed by the legislature. The e-board will then reconvene, discuss revenue forecasts for state fiscal year 2027, and then they'll also discuss state fiscal year 2026, which is the current fiscal year right now, and then next year, state fiscal year 2028. So all that information gets put into an operating statement by the Agency of Administration, and then it's taken to the next board meeting, which will be in February 2026, which has not been scheduled yet. And then the board will be able to discuss at that meeting. And then finally, by May or June, the legislature will authorize the budget. And then the following July, at the beginning of the new fiscal year, so that will be fiscal year 2027, state agencies receive spending authority in implementing that new budget. And that's it.
Nice job.
I think passing over to you, Gianna.
Yeah. Are there any questions on the timeline? I think the board is relatively familiar with that at this point.
And maybe I'll just add that if things do seem to be more unsteady budget-wise, we can always reconvene the board more than this process outlines on an emergency basis. So we'll take it stepwise and hope things go smoothly.
Right. I think many members were on the board when we had to respond to COVID, and we had to call an additional session of the board to basically outline a rescission plan because we had a sharp impact on our revenues. I don't foresee any revenue related like change, but sometimes you just don't foresee them, right? But it's more likely, something like that might come from other policy directions.
Okay. So I'm going to go through the clean water budget drafting approach for you all. This sort of reflects some of the more recent practices we've taken to build and present a draft budget to the board in October. We'll hopefully remind the board of some of the resources we use, like the clean water policy document and the contingency reserve guidelines document and why we use them, and hopefully sort of inspire the discussion a little bit to understand the context that we work in when we draft up the budget and the approach we use. So there's typically 4 drafting steps: understanding and setting the budget targets, distributing what we call base funds, addressing what we predict to be short-term influxes and assigning uses for those influxes, and then verifying that the distribution of funds across the budget aligns with statutory priorities. And so I'm going to go through each of these 4 steps for you all. And also, this is something that we tend to present in October, but we're just bumping this up to July as we feel like this is maybe more helpful at this point. So the first is setting budget targets. There are typically 2 sources of funds that go into the clean water budget: the clean water fund dollars and the capital bill dollars. So the clean water fund dollars have 3 revenue sources: unclaimed beverage deposits, property transfer tax, clean water surcharge, and the meals and rooms tax. Collectively, the diversity and the volume of that fund contributes to its relative sufficiency. It brings in about $25 million a year. And the whole fund is managed on revenue projections. So as Colleen was saying, the e-board provides projections of what will be pulled in for the fiscal year. And then the Clean Water Board builds a budget around spending the same year that we project to be receiving those revenues. So biannually, the Clean Water Fund operating statement is provided to the Clean Water Board. And then what we do as we build the budget in the fall is use the most recent operating statement, the July-August one, to set the budget target for the Clean Water Fund revenue for that fiscal year. The capital bill dollars are come from the capital bill, the clean water section of the capital bill, and that's passed every other year out of the State House. And so every other year, the board either already knows what's given to them, or we conservatively project around 10 to 12 million. And we rely on both of those to contribute to the full 50 million for the Clean Water Initiative. So that's setting budget targets, kind of understanding what we're aiming for. The next step is to distribute what we call base funds. Board members might recognize this as sort of the left side of the budget table. And this is where we determine what is the level of funding needed to maintain funding program stability in pace with long-term program growth and demand. So we try to do something that's predictable in the long term and stable in the long term. And some of these line items we're also trying to figure out what is the level needed so that we can draw down ongoing and core expected federal dollars, this like baseline non-federal match that we're going to need year after year. And then what we do is once we understand the needs across these line items, we kind of distribute Clean Water Fund versus capital dollars using the strategy on the bottom of the slide. So we maximize capital bill dollars, obviously for capital eligible activities, reserve the Clean Water Fund as much as we can for those non-capital eligible activities. We try to limit capital bill dollars to as few line items as possible. And then we try to punt the Clean Water Fund dollars to the higher parts of the budget. Those are the higher statutory priorities, just because in statute, the prioritization really applies to the Clean Water Fund, not the full budget. So moving on to 3. Then we address short-term influxes and uses. So there's a couple times or reasons that the budget might see or realize sort of a short-term income into the budget. Folks might recall when American Rescue Plan Act dollars were assigned to the board for recommendation. So we had 3 fiscal years where there was a one-time boost of ARPA money. There is interest earned on the fund, and so that's just most recently, the board started projecting that interest earned, but interest both actual earned and projected is seen as short term. And then there's unallocated, unreserved, actual and projected dollars. And so that occurs when the most recent fiscal year closes out under budget. Recall that you're building a budget about 1.5 years before we actually know what came in. And so sometimes we're under budget. We have a little bit more than we expected, and that rolls forward. And we categorize that as one time, not to be expected to be repeated in the long term. And that happens for the recently closed out fiscal year, but also the current fiscal year if our projections have kind of moved up since we've just budgeted for that year. So you have both projected and actual unrealized that's rolling forward. And then we look at those dollars and we try to find short-term uses for those dollars. So it might be short-term gaps in the budget. It might be a one-time opportunity to draw down federal funding or to replenish as needed line items. Hi, Jane, welcome. And then the last step is to verify that the distribution of the budget really aligns with statutory priorities. And so 10 VSA 1389E articulates for the board what sorts of line items should be funded as a first priority, second priority, third priority. And so this slide kind of reflects that for you all so you can see that visually. Some of them are specific funding programs. Some of them are sort of generally what we're trying to achieve with the dollars. And what the board has done the last couple of years is interpreted prioritization as a proportion. So what we aim to do when we look at the budget on the right is sort of just a snapshot. You don't need to be able to read these lines, but just seeing that at the very top are these tier 1 line items, and then the middle is tier 2, and then there's tier 3. Other priority tiers are line items that persist on the budget because they reflect other statutory priorities. For example, Lakeland Crisis Fund is not actually articulated in the priorities, but is still in statute, or other ways that we need to draw down and maximize our opportunities on federal funding, like the Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund. And what we aim to do is usually like a 60-30-10 breakdown across these. Of course, it changes year to year based on external funding opportunities for these line items as well. And so this pie chart just gives you an example from last year where you can see the majority of the budget really going to those tier 1 initiatives, 18% to tier 2. And, oh, I'm so sorry, the percentage is cut off for tier 3 and other. And then the last thing just to remind the board of before I pass it on to Tim is that there are 2 sort of governing documents to be aware of and to reflect back on. The first is the budget policy document. So this is This is presented to the board in October in partnership with the budget sheet and really is seen as the articulation of how these dollars will be used. There are narrative descriptions of every line item, and the beginning of the document also articulates the budget approach. So it's typically these best practices, but also anything else that the board has directed us to do or any changes or nuances, so you can see how the budget was built and then what it's intended to be used for. And if there are changes made by the agency, we reflect back on this document to make sure it's still in alignment with what the board intended and was approved. And then the other document is the contingency reserve guidelines. And the board may recall there's $2.5 million held in reserve. It doesn't show up on the budget sheet, but it shows up in the operating statement. It's held in reserve on the fund. It's roughly 10% of the fund amount. And the intent is in those instances where the budgeted dollars actually are above what comes in for revenue and we have a shortfall and we have a gap. And it's a way to make whole all the commitments, because recall we were spending the same year we are accruing those dollars. We've already got signed agreements and contracts. This provides some stability and security to be able to make good on that and continue to progress. The contingency reserve guidelines articulate the use of this line item and how the board may replenish it. And they're welcome to revisit the guidelines at any time, as well as the amount in the risk reserve. I'll stop there. If there's any questions, I'm happy to take them. Otherwise, we can move on to the next section of the agenda.
Anna?
Thanks. Okay. So the next section, like Chair Farnham mentioned, is sort of a summary for the board of some context around this budgeting season. And we're going to start with Tim. I do believe you're on the call. I saw your name.
Super bright. Apologies for that. Hello.
Oh, great.
Hey.
Hi. Welcome.
Hey. Welcome. So this is I'm Tim Mater with the Department of Finance and Management, and I was going to give a quick overview of the February 2025 Clean Water Fund operating statement. So if you remember, in February I had a meeting, and that was because in January, after updating to the January e-board forecast with a projected revenue reduction of $120,000, which impacted FY26. So to offset that reduction in revenue, there was the line item for non-federal match in the agency administration, and that was reduced from $850,000 to $730,000. And y'all made that decision, agreed upon that decision in the February Clean Water Board meeting. So we should, based on the projections from the e-board forecast, end FY26 at a balance of zero. And then I just want to let you know that at the mid-August meeting we have scheduled, there'll be a Clean Water Fund operating statement update that appreciates the July e-board revenue forecast and the FY25 actuals, like those haven't occurred yet. That's all I had.
Thank you so much, Tim. I appreciate that. So that's a great reminder and summary of what the board ended up doing in February, adjusting the recommendation to the legislature. And also a reminder, last year was new and exciting in that we sort of fully allocated the budget targets in the fall. And so we had sort of a $0 line item. And then when February came around, the revenue projections had downgraded just slightly, just 120,000, and that sort of kicked into gear the board's adjustment to the recommendation. So that's something the board can consider in terms of approach this year, if you'd like to continue to do that. Or what has been done in the past is leaving a little bit of a buffer in the case of a downgrade to not have to update a recommendation outside of the public comment cycle. So kind of providing that context and process, if that's helpful for folks, and it's, board decision or preference, really, which way to go there. Do you want to add anything there?
Thanks, Gianna. That was really helpful. And in this case, the budget was going through the legislative process when we had this update in revenue, and there was a non-federal match line item that was intended to help leverage and bring in more federal dollars. That line item, I think, was a great fit to be able to absorb that reduction, given the shift in some of the federal funding availability and the outlook there, without providing much programmatic impact. So I think that was a good decision on the board's part to move forward with that. And at any point when we have these revenue downgrades, there is also the option to activate the contingency reserve. But it can also be strategic to build in just a little bit of buffer, depending on, how we want to approach risk, to just provide even more certainty and avoid the need to do any budget adjustments. But that's the only bit of context that I would add. Chair Farnham, do you have anything that you'd like to add there?
Just really briefly, I think there are a couple ways we could end up approaching it. We could agree on as a board on an if-then approach where we identify if there are reductions, this is the first line item it would come out of. We may not have that convenient of a decision this cycle, right? So I think the state revenues, as Tim said, those haven't been made official. That'll be happening over the next couple of weeks. They're generally looking fairly stable though. So I don't see any massive news coming out of the state level update. It's really the flow through impacts and how we adjust to the federal changes that'll be a question we can't fully answer right now.
Okay. We are going to move on to the next piece of context for you all. In supporting material 5 is the summary of acts related to the clean water budget from the 2025 legislative session. And Secretary Moore will talk about the other two, but I'm going to zoom in for a minute on Act 37, an act relating to stormwater management. This did a lot of things related to the 3-acre parcels, the impervious acre parcels, but there were some specific things that the legislature asked of the Clean Water Board that we really want to draw your attention to. The first one is that the act repeals the 2027 sunset on the property transfer tax clean water surcharge, which means that as that third revenue source for the Clean Water Fund will continue for now. And then the legislature asked us to report back to them beginning January 2028 whether this revenue generated by the surcharge remains necessary to fulfill the clean water initiatives. So this underlined language gives you a copy and paste from the act of what this report back is asked to do. And then we've included this analysis as a board action item within the state fiscal year 2028 budgeting cycle, which occurs in the fall of 2027, so that we can make sure that this is something that the board reviews and responds back to. Another piece that really actually affects this particular state fiscal year's budgeting cycle is that it provided direction to the Clean Water Board for a one-time $5 million from the budget for this year to go to a specific line item, the Municipal Stormwater Implementation Program. And then after that, at least $1 million a year through October 1st, 2032 for the Municipal Stormwater Implementation Program line item. And so this is money that supports municipally owned or municipally sponsored adopted 3-acre sites, along with other municipal stormwater obligations like the MS4 program and
Municipal roads general.
Thank you, municipal roads general permit. So these are a lot of the tier. This particular item falls under the tier 2 in the budget for you all. Briefly, just for your awareness, it does extend the deadline by which 3-acre sites need to gain permit coverage by 5 years. So folks in Lake Champlain and Lake Memphremagog don't need to gain coverage now until October 1st, 2028. And then for the other side of the state, it's October 1st, 2038, or no less than 5 years by which we have a binding stormwater waste load allocation for that watershed, just in case we do end up getting a TMDL for that side of the state. That would kick into gear before the 2038 deadline. It does expand eligibility under the tier 3 for you all, the Developed Lands Implementation Program, so that we can financially support sub 3-acre sites. There are a few impervious sites that have less than 3 acres, but are still subject to very similar requirements in terms of evaluating feasibility on their sites and retrofitting for stormwater controls. It removes the linkage between developed lands and the municipal stormwater program to the clean water service provider tier 1 adequate progress, which effectively just frees up more money more quickly for regulated sites. It provides financial assistance towards, it prioritizes financial assistance towards all these sites if they're used for a residential purpose. And it also articulates that we can use the Municipal Stormwater Implementation Program line item to launch and support municipal stormwater utility expenses. There's a study committee that is coming online soon, a technical guidance that is coming online, a public resource guidance required for us, and then also a re-notification to all property owners, not just the permittees as well. So I'll pause there for that, and we'll return to this document when we provide the other legislative updates. But the last thing to let you all know, so as you can appreciate, oh, Secretary Moore, yes, I see your hand up.
I just wanted to add a little bit more context as to why we received all that direction, Gianna, which is, as folks I'm sure are aware, the 3-acre stormwater regulatory program is really important in terms of our ability to achieve the overall reductions needed for the Lake Champlain phosphorus TMDL, which included retrofitting a significant number of acres throughout the basin for stormwater management. And this means parcels and businesses that when they were built were not subject to stormwater regulations. And as a result, this is somewhat contentious. I think as the owners of those 3-acre sites are digging into what it will take to comply, it has raised another level of concern. And so the legislature is really responding to that concern and trying to identify ways to help provide cost share. We've recognized since the inception of Act 64 in 2007 that the total cost just for the 3-acre stormwater component of our work is probably north of $300 million. And, you know, again, because it's a retrofit program, you have a lot of property owners expressing concern that they're being held to a different and very expensive standard. So this is going to be an ongoing dialogue, but I think keeping in mind both the importance of the 3-acre stormwater program to our overall water quality goals for Lake Champlain, the expensive nature of that work, and as it comes to the fore and becomes real, the contentious nature of the cost, I think are going to be with us for the next several years.
Thank you for providing that additional context. That was wonderful.
So I'd like to throw out one piece of additional context. When I was visiting Asheville, North Carolina recently, they in Asheville, they do not have any significant form of stormwater regulation or management. And that was actually one thing I talked to a number of the property owners about, was that you could see many situations, and it wasn't just a clean water problem. In their situation, the system got so much water that you could see where there was damage coming to adjacent property owners from a lack of any form of stormwater management. So I think this is actually lines up well with an upcoming topic, that there's a really strong clean water reason to do stormwater management, and there's also a resilience and climate adaptation purpose, which our most recent storms have highlighted how important proper stormwater management is. So I think it's a challenging one to work through, but I'm glad the legislature is continuing to help us work through it and not just say this is too hard, because Asheville for me showed me a lot of examples of why we need to continue down the path and figure out how to, you know, it's always challenging to figure out how to pay for something, but it's worth it.
Thank you.
And maybe just on a positive note, we got a real great jump start on the 3-acre work with the American Rescue Plan Act funding, some of which was allocated through the Clean Water Board. And so through that, roughly $40 million invested in 3-acre, many sites. How many sites through the Permit Obtainment Assistance Program?
There's 180 through the Permit Obtainment Assistance Program. And then when you pair the money with the Lake Champlain Basin Program assistance, I mean, we're up to like 60 to 70 million supporting 3-acre sites across Lake Champlain and Lake Memphremagog areas.
So there's some real momentum getting projects into the pipeline and providing technical and financial assistance to sites. So we're not starting from scratch, but definitely we'll need to, as Secretary Moore highlighted, really dig in and figure out a way to support these sites and to leverage the limited funding we can to make this more affordable. So feeling optimistic, but it certainly will be a challenge ahead, and we are looking forward to digging in.
Thank you. So I'm in my screen share, I'm just flipping back to the agenda. The next couple items don't have material to share. We just finished giving you a summary of Act 37, and you can appreciate the sort of bigger context there, demands on the budget, but also their very specific direction for this coming fiscal year budgeting process. The other thing to flag for you all is the clean water service providers. This is the first year that they are really getting their feet under them in terms of reporting back to us on their verification and maintenance of all their clean water projects. So the clean water service providers are stood up under the water quality restoration formula grants, which are a tier 1 line item in your budget. And they advance voluntary clean water projects across Lake Champlain and Lake Memphremagog to make reductions in phosphorus. And they've been working for a few years now, and now they're going back to the projects that they've implemented and reporting back to us through very specific tools, which are still standing and which might have been damaged from flood loss or other reasons. And so we've asked them every year to report back to us. And just about now, we know of at least 1 or 2 that have experienced some project losses. And you might recall last year, the board updated the contingency reserve guidelines as a secondary use of that line to address project losses that come in from the clean water service providers. So we're working in the next month or 2 to know what that dollar amount might be, what the exact losses might be, et cetera, and bringing that to the board, but want you to be cognizant of that additional demand on the line items this year. And with that, I will pass to our director, Emily Bird.
Okay, so I'm going to provide a little bit of context on the federal funding impacts for the clean water budget. This will be really important for us to continue to monitor and discuss as we move through the clean water budget process. And I certainly welcome input from Chair Farnham, Secretary Moore, and others as we discuss this, but I have some points to run through with you all. So the federal funding outlook is important context for the board in making the upcoming budget recommendation and for general clean water budget programmatic management. Changes at the federal level are already impacting funding policy and economic outlook. And since January, you may have heard that we've been navigating some freeze and thaw in federal funding, changes in policy around climate change and environmental justice. And our colleagues at federal agencies staffing levels have been reduced significantly in many cases, and this has resulted in some slowdowns in authorizing federal funds, delays in launching funding rounds ahead of the field season, and also some hesitation of partners and funding recipients to proceed with federally funded projects given some of the uncertainty and concern about risk of being mid-project implementation and potentially funds being put on hold and all of the risk that may carry. So at this point, however, most of the federal funding freezes have been resolved, and the March continuing resolution authorized federal funding at roughly level funding. So that is good news. However, the administration's proposed budget for federal fiscal year 26 proposed zeroing out many of the federal programs that are supporting clean water. However, we do expect that will likely evolve as it goes through the legislative process. And I think breaking just this morning, we heard an update that the House Appropriations, Interior, Environment, and related agencies appropriations bill for federal fiscal year 26, rather than zeroing out, for example, the state clean water, the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, it's projecting a roughly 25% decrease from FY25 levels. So this is far from being final, but we continue to monitor this very closely and work with our congressional delegation to understand where things are heading and to provide them with input on the importance of these programs for Vermont. But also, even with continued federal funding, I had mentioned that the staffing levels at federal agencies have been reduced significantly. And so this will likely continue to impact the timeliness of awarding federal dollars. In particular, in the agricultural sector, the engineering staff at USDA are a critical piece in being able to proceed with project implementation. So that's important to be aware of, and our colleagues within ANR and with the Agency of Agriculture are working really closely together to think about how we can leverage limited engineering capacity in the state to fill some gaps. But that will certainly be an ongoing challenge for us to monitor. And just to provide a little bit of context, my colleague Claire Madden ran some data from the annual performance report, and overall federal funding is a major contributor to clean water efforts in Vermont, and federal funding sources represented approximately 43% of funding reported for clean water between state fiscal year 2020 and 2025. So that gives you kind of a sense of the piece of the pie that we are able to capture in terms of contributions for federal funding. And that excludes American Rescue Plan Act from that analysis because that was a short-term influx. So just wanted to provide that little bit of context for you all, and to give a high-level overview of what we're talking about with some of our primary federal funding sources. That includes the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, which supports water infrastructure financing and loan subsidy. We also have the Lake Champlain Basin Program dollars that help to support it. The Basin Program runs their own funding programs externally through their organization, and those dollars also come to the state through DEC, and those funds also get passed through to the Agency of Ag to provide project implementation and support program staff. And then we have our Section 319 funding for non-point source work, and that supports staff at DEC and Agency of Ag. And then we have a significant amount of funding into the agricultural and forestry sector through the U.S. Department of Agriculture Natural Resource Conservation Service. And our colleagues at VTrans are also leveraging federal transportation funding into these programs. Reductions in federal funding to support project work could also slow down progress in our clean water efforts and the outputs and outcomes that we are able to report on each year. So this will be as we go through our annual performance report process and we engage with the board, the federal EPA, and with the legislature to explain our progress and what types of impacts are affecting our progress. It'll be something for us to continue to monitor. So all of this is really to set the stage that the federal funding outlook may place greater budgetary pressures on the clean water budget. For several years now, we have had the benefit of having unallocated, unreserved funds to budget as one-time funds to boost our efforts. And we've tried to be very conservative in setting expectations between base and one-time funds. But it's likely that we are moving away from the days of having those one-time unallocated, unreserved boosts in our budget. And we'll need to be really strategic to support our programs, projects, and personnel that are supported by the clean water budget. So on the program and project side of things, many of our clean water funding programs in Vermont are supported with the state revenue, but also with federal funding. So we'll need to think about how the two leverage together. And many line items in the clean water budget also provide non-federal match to leverage those federal dollars, and reduced access to federal funds could place greater pressure on the clean water budget to fund those programs and fill gaps. On the personnel side of things, clean water funding programs are led and administered by agency staff who really get those dollars out the door to partners to do projects on the ground. And many agency staff who are implementing clean water programs are funded with federal dollars. And the state of Vermont has always prioritized clean water dollars for pass-through implementation efforts. That's been a longstanding policy for good reason to really target these dollars to implementation. And roughly 3 to 5%, it varies a little bit year to year, a very small percentage of the budget is used for personnel. But we may run into circumstances where if those federal sources become unstable, there could be pressure on the clean water budget to assume more personnel funding. And that's something that we will need to work together to define what is appropriate in terms of the clean water budget, helping to fill gaps or not. And so we'll be looking to the board to help us establish priorities and where it is appropriate for the clean water budget to fill gaps. We also suggest that for at least a few years, one of our goals may be to maintain these core programs so that they can endure into the future. And that may necessitate some short-term adjustments to our budgeting approach while setting expectations to return to our longer-term general set of policy and priorities. And recommendations from the Clean Water Board will also need to be considered by the administration in the full context of federal funding reductions, such as Medicaid, SNAP, electric vehicle charging, et cetera. And I may let Chair Farnham speak to that a bit more in a moment. And I'll just close by reminding folks that each year we put together a report for the legislature that's due September 1st. And that compiles the federal funding that is available to support water quality improvement efforts in Vermont. So that gives a pretty comprehensive overview of how our federal funding is tracking and any anticipated changes for the year ahead. So we'll be sure to make that report available to the board as soon as it is final. And we are working with the interagency work group to compile those data currently. Chair Farnham, anything you'd like to add to that?
No, that's great, Emily. Sorry. Let's move to Jane, and then I can kind of add some more thoughts.
Okay, great.
So we're joined here by Jane from the Climate Action Office. Thank you, Jane, to give an overview of the resilience implementation strategy. So let me scroll down. Just let me know as you want me to move through.
Yeah, thanks so much, Gianna, and everyone for having me. Jane Lazorchek. I work in the Secretary's office with the Climate Action Office within the Agency of Natural Resources. I'm just going to spend a few minutes introducing you all to the Resilience Implementation Strategy, which was launched by the Governor and the Treasurer's Office in January of 2024, and we're beginning to wrap it up this summer. The initiative, which acknowledged the impacts of the flooding in the summer of 2023, before we actually felt further impacts over 2024, and then again just last week, acknowledged the space in which clean water and many of the programs in state government work either intentionally or tangentially through secondary and co-benefits of addressing resilience and adaptation in our state. And understanding and expecting the legislature to want to sort of dive in real deep to think about how state government could serve and address the concerns, considering the flooding impacts. Wanted to acknowledge and first take a step back to inventory and look at what state government was doing around building resilience and adaptation. The Climate Action Office has staffed this, but we did not do it alone. We were complemented with a steering committee of which we worked both with all of the agencies across state government that really have a stake in these kinds of programmatic work around resilience and adaptation, and dug deep into programmatic staff even here within our agency, with first Neil and then Gianna stepping in to support and acknowledge the important role that clean water work plays with respect to resilience and adaptation. This acknowledged the work that we were already doing through the State Hazard Mitigation Plan, the Climate Action Plan, and really looked to work hand in hand to think about how we really further prioritize and acknowledge what was really needed to happen right now, looking also long-term about priorities, understanding that much of the work in like the Climate Action Plan, for instance, is like everything in the kitchen sink that needs to be done and doesn't often strategically prioritize what we can actually capacitize and move forward. The Climate Action Plan was adopted, the new one, July 1st of 2025. And we also moved forward with putting forward the recommendations for the resilience implementation strategy at the same time, July 1st of this year. So I'm going to just give you a little bit of a piece of what we've done and what the buckets of work are, and then really acknowledge what the handoff looks like over the course of the next few months to finish the work in partnership with the Treasurer's Office. So when the treasurer and the governor put forward this, they acknowledged 5 core buckets of which we wanted to focus the recommendations by first inventorying what government was doing. And I say that over and over because this is really focused on not the whole of Vermont and Vermont's work, but really what the role of government is in addressing resilience and adaptation, and then looking forward on how we could address the gaps and opportunities that exist. So we took a focus on community-centric approach, nature-based solutions, infrastructure development, early warning systems, and economic and environmental sustainability. As we started to dive into what that looked like, we acknowledged that all of this work should be built on better systematic work in government, acknowledging that we often work in silos, could do better job of partnering, and so wanted to think about our recommendations building upon better governance as well. And so we came up with this sort of 6th bucket that cross-cuts across all of them around government systems. Last slide, Gianna. So we acknowledged almost 300 programmatic works that looks at planning, grants, funds, programs, staff, work that's happening. We built an opportunity assessment, which is a database that we now maintain and hope to update in state government, ultimately making it public across. Right now it's internal to ANR, but we're thinking about how we can make that available as a resource to others. We put forward those recommendations and worked really closely to develop a prioritization criteria in close concert with the implementers, the folks where we saw the greatest opportunity, so that we weren't putting forward recommendations void of capacity and interest to move them forward. And worked really closely with the steering committee, which again, Gianna sat on, and reached out across DEC to think about the implementers of clean water programs, understanding that clean water is one of our greatest opportunities to think about where we're already building resilience and adaptation through those projects. How can we intentionally do it better? And there's a lot of recommendations around clean water in the RIS. And so we thought about those recommendations. There are just under 60 tier 1 recommendations, and then a suite of tier 2 recommendations, about a similar number, that are also of interest, but still need further work. So right now we're very focused on the tier 1 recommendations. We've handed those off, and I think what's unique about this, unlike many of our other plans and opportunities that we do in government, to the treasurer's office on July 1st, and are working really closely with them to think about the costing of those recommendations. So what would each of those cost, and then what are some creative funding and financing solutions that go beyond just grants? So what are some of the creative strategies we can look at? The Climate Action Office has some small seed money to put at some of those intentional recommendations. And the next step for us is really to work closely with the secretary, the governor, the treasurer, to think about how we further advocate for policy changes, programmatic work, capacitize that through the Climate Action Office with our partners in government to actually move forward the recommendations over the course of the next few years. Our hope is that this is an iterative process, that the steering committee stays engaged, the recovery office stays engaged. I should have mentioned right from the onset that the recovery office has been at the table on the steering committee as well, thinking a lot about the sort of handoff between recovery and long-term resilience and adaptation, because it is a blurred line, thinking about how we do that well and intentionally. And so the slides I provided give you a little bit of a look into the work and the process, but I also shared a link with Gianna and all of you that links to our website that gives you more background information on the development of the RIS itself. We have a briefing with the governor in 2 weeks, of which at the same time we'll launch a press release and a new website that will have really a deep dive look into what the recommendations are and the plan for moving those forward. So it's a stay tuned. The recommendations have been developed, but there's further work to think about the costing and how we operationalize those in government.
Great. Thank you so much, Jane. Appreciate you joining us. Chair Farnham, this is sort of the summary. You're welcome if you have anything else you'd like to summarize as we lead into board discussion.
Yeah, I think we've covered a lot of the ground, so I won't hammer it too much, but we will see at the end of this month how exactly state revenues shake out, but we don't anticipate any big shifts in one direction or the other. I do think we have a lot of challenges ahead of us this budgeting cycle, primarily from the uncertainty and the adjustment at the federal level. One thing I would say, in addition to the freezing and thawing that Emily talked about, we also have seen a heavy consolidation of decisions and approvals in the new federal administration from things that used to be run programmatically, where if we worked with those staff, if those staff told us it was okay, then those awards would go through. In some places, we're seeing the decisions being consolidated up to the secretary, even the secretary level for federal agencies, to where decisions are being made a little bit more politically than programmatically. And so that's something we're going to have to live with for the next couple of years, right? That is within the federal administration's authority to do things that way. And it just does change. And I think for a lot of our service providers, that's going to be an additional element that continues to make them very uncertain and very nervous about working on any federally funded projects. So I think we have the real numerical impacts, but then we do have the accumulation of uncertainty. And I think the more thorough we can be this cycle in beginning to implement some of the RIS recommendations, and I think I definitely agree, this is something that's iterative, right? Like we don't want to rush it. We can't expect to wholesale change our systems in 1 year. We've seen what massive sharp left turns do to programs. And I think, and that's where we want to demonstrate improvement. We want to demonstrate thoughtful progress. But we don't want to add to that uncertainty at all, right? So I think we'll probably pick items that seem the least controversial, the easiest to get in these first couple of cycles. And I'm hoping that the board members don't feel frustrated by that approach. But I do think resilience and clean water, we've known this was always like a 40-year effort in the Clean Water Board. And resilience is even longer than that, honestly. So I think it will be a very challenging year, but I think we've got a great board, and I think we can start the discussion today, but again, we are just evaluating the impacts of the federal legislation that passed recently, and a lot of our answers for how will affect our specific budget won't come until the fall either. So we have some timing issues that we won't have full information, and we'll be speculating a bit.
Bob's hand is up.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. And I know many of you know this already, but from the field here, we've been coached to perhaps alter vocabulary in terms of some of the wording for some of the actions we're doing. So not changing the actions, but framing them differently. And that includes technical assistance for some of the things we've been talking about. So I presume you all are aware of that and are thinking of similar things as we go forward. And while not changing the actions or changing the priorities of what we all want to accomplish, the way that we speak about them and the terminology we use might need to be tweaked.
Bob, that's a great point. Actually, when I was visiting Swannanoa, which was the community in the Asheville area that was hit the hardest by some of the flooding, where they had entire neighborhoods that were just gone, like hundreds of houses that were just no longer there because the river just swept through what was essentially a rarely used floodway, but it was floodway at the end of the day. And one of my core pieces of advice to them was, when you're writing your grant applications, when you're applying, always reset yourself and say, who am I applying to? What do they need to hear in order to give me assistance? We do get caught, especially in Vermont, on focusing on our priorities and our language and talking about why it's important to us. And when you're applying to the feds or a private funder or anyone, you should always be focusing on what's important to them. And so I think it's perfectly legitimate to use the language that we think is going to get us the most opportunities. Vermont has always had problems competing for federal dollars. That and the current gap between how we think about goals and how the federal administration thinks about goals would only make our competition that much harder. So I think we do need to adapt and do our best to compete for the dollars, because otherwise we're definitely going to lose competitive opportunities. Yeah.
We're into the discussion, Chair Farnham. We can leave it as any of these questions or whatever the board would like to talk about in terms of setting some strategic direction for the year.
Right. Let's start out talking about the interest income. We'll see. Hopefully this one might not take too long. I think we started the practice of estimating this interest income, projecting it to the best of our ability. The interesting economic conditions of the last 6 months have caused the interest rates to stay a little bit higher than otherwise would have been predicted. So I don't think this revenue stream is tapering as quickly as we thought it might. So it is still significant to the same extent it was last budget cycle. Not hugely, not changing dramatically what we're able to do. And I do think this smaller amount of money, right? I think this ties into, for me, how do we approach some of that uncertainty and how do we buffer against uncertainty, right? Last budget cycle, we recommended the AOA appropriation for federal match. And I think we're all feeling like that. We're not seeing a lot of new federal opportunities. So I think it's unlikely that we'll actually get a chance to leverage that language. And this interest income for me is an opportunity to at least have something we can put towards any gaps that are opening up over the next 5 or 6 months. I don't know, do any board members have any strong feelings one way or the other about how we're approaching that interest income? And if we want to retain it on the operating statement? Jim?
Yeah, I'd rather wait till we see the actuals for last year and put it in a broader discussion of what's our contingency reserve versus single it out right now and say we're not going to budget interest income.
Yep.
And maybe also just one reminder that we did strategically put projected interest income into a one-time category of the budget. So something of that nature could be employed again this year in terms of kind of setting it aside as its own flavor of risk or uncertainty, perhaps. I apologize, Secretary Moore. I didn't intend to cut you off.
No. I was going to say something very much along those lines. I mean, I think we have a $2.5 million reserve, right? That's fully funded. It's always this delicate dance or balance that we're trying to strike between making investments now and making sure we have the necessary cushion to sustain this work for the long term, particularly in periods of great uncertainty. And Emily, I think that suggestion of potentially looking at the interest income as a category when we're asking the staff level team to bring that initial budget recommendation back as one-time money, to my mind, sort of splits that balance. And I think then we can further refine that as per Jim's suggestion once we have the benefit of the e-boards report in a couple weeks' time. But I guess at the same time, I'm reluctant to potentially hold additional resources back, knowing we have sort of that $2.5 million cushion already in place.
And we will, at the same time, we're able to formally update the operating statement with the e-board's projections. We will have the actuals for FY 25's interest income. So we will know how, everything shook out, projections compared to the actuals. We do know what the current rates are, and I think we, especially with the current Fed chair, don't anticipate any dramatic shifts in interest. They've shown a very incremental approach, despite significant amounts of pressure to deviate from that. They're staying kind of methodical in their approach to adjusting the interest rates. Opening it up on prioritization. And can talk this through, or this just gets thrown out for people to start thinking about. If funding is tighter, what additional criteria should the interagency work group apply to prioritize needs? Obviously, if we don't pass the information to the interagency working group, which is going to start working soon, they can't consider it during their process. So I think, and then what information would be helpful for the board to review prioritization? If there are kind of open questions you have, things you need to know before we can even address how to prioritize. Secretary Moore?
Yes, I think it would be helpful to pause here and talk a little bit about the direction or recommendation from the legislature regarding 3-acre stormwater and how we want to address that in providing direction on the FY27 budget. Emily or Gianna can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think it was a requirement from the legislature that we direct that funding, but more of a recommended direction. I think it's one we need to take seriously, but I also know that kind of draw on the Clean Water Fund will have carry-on effects into other parts of our budget. And so hopeful we can spend a little bit of time here hearing from particularly our public board members about how they believe we should proceed.
So likely a year where we may not have substantial one-time funds, but also need to absorb a $5 million or seriously consider recommending a $5 million investment into that program. So that may be a challenge to figure out how it fits.
Yeah, and Emily, I don't know if there's an ability or if it overly complicates the work of the interagency finance team to potentially prepare two budgets, one with that $5 million placeholder in it, and one that then shows, or as maybe even just having an extra column that shows if sort of the team set that level, recognizing the emphasis the legislature is clearly placing on 3-acre stormwater, but to ask for their expert advice if they would recommend the full 5 or maybe 4 or 3 or 2, and if they had a lower amount they would recommend, then how they would distribute the difference. I think having those options and that kind of input and feedback from staff would be really helpful in this moment, because it is, I mean, that's more than 10% certainly of our budget. And just want to be cognizant that that's going to have a place downward pressure on other bodies of work.
Thank you.
Jim?
So Secretary Moore, how would that go across the statutory tiers of the required funding? Is it some would be 1, some 2, do you have an idea?
Well, I think that's a good question. Emily may or Gianna may have spent more time thinking about it. I don't know, Gianna or whoever's controlling the screen, if you have the ability to flip back to that pie chart, but I think that is maybe a helpful place to start, where we've sort of settled on a pretty consistent distribution between tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. You know, and I think the legislature made 3-acre stormwater long-term tier 2, if I'm not mistaken, sort of bumping it up from tier 3 at a $1 million level. But then we have this $5 million ask. And I think there's a good question of if it sort of goes into the other category or comes off the top of maybe tier 1 or tier 2 at this point. But I suspect and defer to the team that this is the kind of input that will be really valuable as they move to prepare a draft budget for us to discuss.
I think Secretary Moore covered a great portion of that. The municipal stormwater implementation line item is specifically in tier 2. There is still the developed lands implementation program, which is tier 3, that would support the private 3-acre sites. So there's certainly some challenge there to make sure that all 3-acre sites are seeing that assistance. The legislature asked us to prioritize residential sites used for residences, which may or may not always go hand in hand with sites that the municipality controls or adopts. And so there's a bit of a tension there between where the board assigns the dollars and where there might be demand and need. But yes, there is this, like Secretary Moore articulated, guidance about where to pull from the board's preferences, and then pulling from, staff recommendations and the interagency work groups recommendations will be really critical and useful there.
Before we go to Bob, the 5 million, is that the delta? It's 5 million of additional funds into that, or is it 5 million related to 1 million or 2 million that was already in the budget?
There's nothing, so the fiscal year 27 has not been built yet. And the last year or two, it's actually been zeroed out, that particular line item. There was some ARPA money that had supported it, and then we relied really heavily on that, so. Bob? Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
So,
no, Bob.
you okay, Doug?
Yeah, yep.
Okay, sorry. So how or does this interface with the discussion that we sort of left a few months ago about establishing a loan program for commercial property owners or others regarding the 3-acre mitigation?
Yes, it interfaces directly with it. Great question, Bob. So the transition that the agency is making now, this is part of the funding. There's funding from the current, what you passed last year's current fiscal year as well, that we're working together with financial institutions to design a funding program. And so collectively, if the board chooses to recommend and the legislature passes 5 million, that gets us up to starting with about 7 million to seed fund a financing program. And so we're working with them to explore the best way to leverage those dollars to bring in the best amount, the best rates for all the potential borrowers, and the best package of support.
But the structure of that was never finalized precisely, correct?
That's correct. That's not something that we've brought to the budget discussion for the board.
Okay, fair,
It's still also under design.
understood. Thank you.
I think it's fair to say we do plan to bring more complete information back to the board later in the budget development cycle, right? That's
Yes.
on our,
Thank you.
that's already part of our plan, Bob.
Yeah, but I think Bob raises an important point that could be
Yeah.
a potential mitigating or factor consideration we want to bring to bear in figuring out how much to budget into 3-acre stormwater, and maybe just given the timeline, and I know the work that's underway on the loan program, that I perhaps self-servingly, but think that may further buttress my suggestion that we actually look at 2 different budget designs of a full 5 million and then a smaller number where we could then point to the loan program as a way to augment the availability of resources for 3-acre implementation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Secretary Moore, that's a good point. I think a parallel is, so after the 23 and 24 floods, we did the Business Emergency Gap Assistance Program, right? Grant program, good, but expensive, very expensive. We then talked about, okay, how do we sustain something? Because we can't afford this going forward. So we created a revolving loan fund program with the Vermont Economic Development Authority that would provide low interest capital to recovering businesses and hopefully in a more cost effective manner achieve some of those same goals as the grant program. Now, obviously, everyone prefers grant programs, but we can't often with these very large needs afford a grant program because we're not making a significant enough dent in the actual expenses with the grants we can afford to give. So I think if we do, the board will have the flexibility to recommend something different than 5. If we do, we all need to feel really good about it, and we need to be ready to go in. And Julie and I are likely to have to go in and testify on why the Clean Water Board recommended something aside from the 5 million and really defend that decision, which I would say we've had some very smooth budgeting cycles for the last 5 years. We've been very fortunate, pretty aligned with the legislature. And I think this is I meant to point out earlier that there is increasing pressure on the capital bill because of the high interest rates, the lending recommendations from that being constrained. There is a lot of pressure. The original intent when the Clean Water Board and the Clean Water process was set up was for the capital bill to always be a part of that picture. That was the intent nearly 10 years ago, or maybe more than 10 years ago. More than 10. I know I was involved in the decision. It's just been a long time. That assumption is now starting to be challenged, and we're having to defend the capital portion of clean water goals more actively every year, I would say. Jim?
So this $5 million number, was that actually put in a bill or in an intent document?
Yes, there was an Act 37, but there was an acknowledgement that the legislature couldn't authorize future fiscal year spending. And so the framing was, my understanding, strategic to advise or not compel, but it basically advised the board to recommend a $5 million allocation. But technically, it's all subject to the upcoming legislative review process, if that makes sense.
So it wasn't a document?
Yes, it's in Act 37.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Jim.
So we've got just a couple minutes. We're a little bit behind now. So let's jump to Secretary Moore for the overview of the legislative session. And if any board members see other items, the topics that we didn't get to on risk management or just open discussion, things you wanted to raise, please send them in so that we can start to think about those as we move into our regular budgeting cycle.
Secretary Moore, would you like me to pull up the Act summary sheet or the budget sheet?
The Act summary sheet, if you would, Gianna. And I think this will be relatively quick, in large part because we've covered the first 2 sections of it. As Gianna is showing, the first bill we wanted to flag for everyone was just the big bill, which enacted the clean water budget that was recommended by the board with that $120,000 downgrade in revenue projections incorporated as was discussed previously. Next, in the biggest section of this table is really around Act 37. And it contains a really nice summary of both the work to sunset what had been the repeal of the property transfer tax. This was also a recommendation of the board, but something we'd been advocating for several years now. So really pleased to see that in place and facilitates our long-term planning around clean water. And then the other pieces of it are really around 3-acre stormwater and interest in having us provide some amount of feedback or advice to the legislature on the cost of compliance and how we can sort of leverage clean water funds to support implementation of the 3-acre permit, as well as extending the deadline for compliance. There's a trade-off there in that providing more time potentially raises the costs of these projects, but it does also give us more time to figure out what is a particularly complicated set of retrofits. As some may recall, the requirement for 3-acre stormwater is limited to the Champlain, Memphremagog, and stormwater impaired watersheds for the time being. It was set to be extended into the Connecticut River side of the state in 2033. A 5-year extension was also placed on that. There isn't the same regulatory driver we have in Champlain and Memphremagog of having an EPA approved TMDL in the Connecticut River side. So it does feel a little bit like we might be getting out in front of something. And particularly given the costs, I think the legislature opted to take a wait and see approach about whether extending these requirements into other parts of the state makes sense. And then the last piece, if you want to keep scrolling down, Gianna, is a piece of, oh, I'm sorry, I jumped a couple of pieces, but this is again more detail around 3-acre stormwater. Interest the legislature has in what we can do to help promote stormwater utilities, either at the municipal or perhaps more so at the regional level, and whether this is a tool that could be useful in supporting 3-acre stormwater. I think part of this interest stems from the fact that municipalities that currently are MS4s, municipal separate sewer systems, or have a utility have been much more willing and able to engage with 3-acre property owners in helping them figure out how best to come into compliance, and oftentimes offering to take over maintenance of those systems once they are built. In communities that don't have a utility or an MS4 permit, we haven't seen that same interest in uptake and providing support to 3-acre parcel owners. And so the legislature also has an interest in understanding better what might be done to encourage the formation of utilities. And then the last piece we wanted to flag for all of you was work we are doing around the CAFO program, our concentrated animal feeding operations. As you may be aware, the Conservation Law Foundation, about the better part of 3 years ago now, filed a dedelegation petition with EPA, expressing or raising concerns about the fact that the Agency of Natural Resources had not issued any CAFO permits to Vermont farms. EPA reviewed the petition, did their own review, did a number of site inspections, and in response engaged us in conversations about the need to develop a corrective action plan to address some of the deficiencies that were identified in the petition CLF had filed. We have been engaged in a back and forth with EPA for just about a year right now over the corrective action plan, have traded drafts and comments, expecting additional comments from EPA in short order. But one of the areas that was clear that was going to be needed as part of our implementation of the corrective action plan was to seek some changes to our enabling statutes. And that's exactly what Act 67 did. It kind of trued us up with the current code of federal regulations around CAFO, gave ANR the authority to inspect farms on our own, as opposed to in conjunction with the Agency of Agriculture. And we will continue to work in this space, and happy to provide a longer update at our next board meeting, when I am hopeful we may have reached final approval with EPA on the corrective action plan. Just one other note in that space, Act 67 asked us to stand up a stakeholder process, particularly working with agricultural producers, to make sure that we're thinking about how a CAFO program fits with their operations, and how we can create a program that supports them in being successful in meeting our shared goals around water quality. And we are actively recruiting for a facilitator to support that process, and expect those conversations with stakeholders will begin in the next month or so.
Thank you, Secretary Moore. We are at the section of public comments.
Great. So we had a handful of folks sign up online for public comment. Given that we are a little bit behind in our agenda, if folks can keep to 2 minutes or less, that would be great. I'm not seeing Alice or Chip online, so we can start with Claire on Teams if you're ready to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Thank you. I'll try to keep this brief. I understand that I really appreciate all the thoughtfulness going into this process. And I know we're not at the position of yet of making hard decisions, but I do want to encourage this board and all of our agency partners to really consider the impacts to Vermont's clean water workforce as we're making budget decisions. A number of line items for the budget are pass through to local level government and nonprofit entities. And those funds go to support individual people who sort of do the boots on the ground work of talking with individual landowners, municipalities about their clean water needs, identifying projects, and then shepherding those projects through to completion. The concern I think we have is that the cost of maintaining those staff it's going up year over year. A couple of meetings ago, I let this board know that we are seeing, 20 to 30% increases in healthcare costs alone. That remains a concern. For a number of these organizations, clean water funds do comprise a large portion of the budget. So we want to make sure that our workforce is able to be maintained. I think the risk we see is that if we're in a position of needing to lay people off or reduce hours, it's going to take us a while to rebuild those programs and to rehire staff that have the technical capacity to do this work. So we really want to maintain what we have now so that we're able to take advantage of additional funding when and if it becomes available. And I think the other concern we have is that, we want to maintain full employment and benefits, particularly in light of potential reductions to social safety net, more broadly here in Vermont. So I just want to encourage everyone to really have that lens as we review the budget, understanding how these funds go through to local level entities and how that impacts our workforce. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment, Claire. Appreciate you taking the time today. Terry, did you sign up online as well?
Yes, I did.
Great.
Oh, no, I just want to thank you for allowing me to be here, number one, because, I was kind of thrust onto that committee, not really knowing what people do. And I just want to say that, during the committee, if I offended anybody, didn't mean to, I kind of get spun up and then like a top and released. And I just think that I need to understand what you go through and how it affects the legislature, how we can help. And that's really why I'm here today. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. And I believe David Provost is on Teams.
I am, thank you, but I have no comments or questions at this time. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
I think I see April.
I didn't have April on, or maybe was it?
Oh, different April?
Oh, it was Alice.
I had Alice.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But if anybody, is there anyone else in attendance that would like to share a public comment with the board? You can feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself. Not seeing any. Maybe we can move forward with final wrap up. Okay. So some announcements. We have a upcoming clean water conversation on the clean water budget on October 7th from 12 to 1. And in the meeting materials and agenda, there's links to register and find more information. This is really intended to share with the public more information and understanding about the clean water budget development process, and also ultimately engage the public more.
Sorry, Sarah, that's on August 7th, not October 7th.
Oh, excuse me. I misspoke. Thank you, Colleen. we have the upcoming clean water budgeting dates. The Clean Water Board meeting in October 9th is next, and then November 7th, we have a public hearing. Our next Clean Water Board meeting is on December 2nd, and we have the public comment period October 16th to November 16th, as Colleen went over earlier. There's a reminder to subscribe to the Clean Water Stakeholder Listserv. And we also, with a link in the materials, and there's also a link in the Teams that Jane shared in Teams, as well as in the materials, to stay tuned with the Climate Action Office site page to access more information about the resilience implementation strategy. Great, that's it.
Nicely done. Way to land the plane at this last second. Good work, everybody. I would say we don't always respond to public comment, but I will say that in the moment, right, and when we have the comment period, we obviously respond to the comment period through that formal process. But one thing I will share right now is that in recovery and working with the administration prior to that, various roles, capacity and the stability of capacity is important for our long-term progress and growth as a state. So I am very sensitive to that. I think we should all try to be mindful of, we're going to have to accept trade-offs. And my personal perspective is that we should err on the side of stability, knowing that it might slow down some of our progress, knowing that we might see a couple of years where we're not able to achieve as many projects, but we are maintaining that capacity and that ability to continue progress in the future, because we have very valuable resources that we've cultivated over the last decade, and we don't want to make any unintentionally short-sighted decisions that would rob us of our ability to access those resources going forward. Once they're gone, they're very difficult to replace. So I think that will be a key element for me as we go into this further budget discussions. So thank you, everyone, thank you, board members, thank you, members of the public, for attending. And that concludes today's Clean Water Board meeting. Look forward to seeing you at the next meeting.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, bye.